back. I'm going to read Chapter 7 called The Long Sioux. An hour later, the brigade reached a second rapids. They tracked this stretch of water, pulling each craft up the rapids with the 60-yard line. Not football, 60-yard line. A 60-yard line. One man stood in the bow and two in the stern, using setting poles to steady the canoe in the swift current. Oh, there goes my light. I was wondering when that was going to happen. The rest of the crew danced from one slippery rock to the next as they hauled their 5,000-pound load upstream. Fed by ice fields in the north, the Ottawa ran deep and cold. Since Pierre was hot and sweaty from paddling, the chilly water felt good at first, but after only a few steps, he lost the feeling in his feet as the wet tracking rope cut into his sore hand. Near the head of the rapids, just as Lalonde and Charbonneau were pulling hard to swing the long birch bark hull clear of a menacing boulder, Pierre slipped and wet himself to his waist. He slipped and wet himself to the waist. I think that just means he got wet. I mean, just my guess. His high-pitched squeal gave the crew good reason to chuckle. As Pierre scrambled back to shore, Charbonneau called out in mock anger, "No swimming on company time, LePage. There's work to be done." "Be careful, tadpole," Bellegarde chortled from the bank. Doesn't really like when Bellegarde says stuff. "There's some hungry turtles in this stream," the crew roared. Pierre scowled. He was freezing cold and feeling sorry for himself. He could have been swept downstream and maybe even drowned. Yet they were laughing at him as if he were a circus clown. But when he saw Lalonde grinning at him, Pierre looked down at his soaked pants and his skinny blue ankles, realizing how silly he must look. He couldn't help but chuckle with the rest of the men. As they pushed out into the broad pool at the head of the rapids, Pierre studied the river bottom. White sand and bright, quartz-flecked pebbles glowed in the shallows, and just where the bottom fell off into sudden blackness, he saw a speckled side of a huge brook trout. As soon as they hit open water, the paddlers fell into a stroke-a-second pace. Pierre's sore hand just began to ache. He tried hard to keep up, hearing his father's words saying, "You'll find no better friends than your canoe mates if you do your part." Well, the day grew hot. Pierre's skin itched, and his pants were drying in the sun. Blue flies, excited by blood smell from Pierre's hand, were buzzing around the canoe. Now, I don't know if you know anything about flies in the summer, but they can bite and it can hurt. The heat made Pierre dizzy. He felt almost as sick as he did 2 winters ago when an earache came on so suddenly that he cried. He was fine 1 minute, then his head would begin to pound, and it felt as if he was shoving a hot pin into his ear. That sounds painful. He got so feverish that his eyes wouldn't focus, and according to his mom, he started to say silly things. He was rambling on about Aunt Millie and a pig and silver snuff box. Though Mother and Camille bathed his forehead with cool rags all night, the pain didn't go away until the middle of the next morning, when his eardrum burst. Ooh, that's not good. Though Mother was afraid he'd be deaf in that ear, his hearing gradually came back. Just then a fat deer fly bit Pierre between the fingers of his right hand, and he dropped his paddle to dig at the throbbing bite. "What's the matter?" Beloit teased. "Does our puppy have fleas?" Boy, they're not very nice to him. Pierre flushed, but he made no comment as the crewmen on all sides started to laugh again. Just once he wished he could dunk Beloit's ugly face into the river. That'd make him feel good. He tried not to scratch the bite, but that made the itching more maddening. Pierre envied the older men with their long hair, which kept the flies off their necks and shoulders. Luckily, there was more bulwark this morning than paddling. If he was careful with the tracking lines, his cuts actually might start to heal. Just after they'd pulled up their canoe on a tight chute bordered by lichen-covered rock ledges, Charbonneau gave Pierre advice. It didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. "If the paddling seems hard, Pierre, it's only because you make it so. To paddle properly, you must forget that you're paddling." Interesting advice. To paddle properly, you must forget that you're paddling. Am I supposed to just order these blisters not to hurt? I mean, it sounds crazy, but is it supposed to work that way? Pierre said, and Charbonneau's tone kind of angered him. "Pain is only a trick of your mind," Charbonneau snapped impatiently. "I have to warn you. We hit the big water real soon, and to paddle 15 hours a day, Your head and heart have to be strong. When we hit that open water, there's nothing like it. When they stopped to recoil their lines a little later, Lalonde took Pierre aside. Listen to your steersman, he gently urged. The truth is a strange dog sometimes, but work is only as hard as we make it. The truth is a strange dog sometimes, but work is only as hard as we make it. There. Focus on a special place. A Christmas long ago, the bonnet of a pretty girl, a birthday. Your paddle becomes a small thing at that point. He admired Lalonde's calm. Pierre could tell the bowman encouraged him for his own good, while Charbonneau only seemed to care about how many miles the brigade would make. When they took up their paddles again, Pierre tried to follow his advice. He tried to distract himself by studying the pines along the riverbank, but his hands still hurt. He recalled the last time that he saw Celeste. Even as he imagined her bright blue eyes, his ears burned at the memory of the awkwardness of their last meeting. The more he thought about the advice, the more foolish it seemed. He'd never made a job easy by forgetting things. And forgetting made his mom angry. How many times had he been sent out after supper to finish a chore that he forgot to do earlier? It isn't fair for the chickens to go hungry because you can't remember your chores, she'd say. Those poor chickens. The brigade finally stopped for breakfast at the base of rapids. There was a short but steep portage. As the canoes coasted up to the landing, Pierre noticed that each man briefly doffed his cap, and he looked up and saw a series of faded red crosses standing on top of a hill. He'd heard about these crosses left in memory of voyageurs who had drowned, but he had never actually seen one. As the men unloaded, Pierre studied the white trough that roared down the boulder-strewn channel. He was awed by anyone that would ever attempt such a run. He looked back up the hill and asked Lalonde, "How many crosses are there?" "Well, 19 as of last fall," Lalonde said. "That many died right here?" Lalonde nodded. In the pool below the rapids, Pierre watched a beaver-gnawed stick bobbing up in the foam. It was easy to imagine a dead man face down in flotsam, spinning in a slow circle. Ooh, that doesn't sound like a good thing to imagine. Why would anyone want to try these rapids? It's a tough carry, was all Lalonde said. Voyageurs don't try it anymore, do they? It's forbidden by the company. The flat tone of Lalonde's voice hinted that this was a policy not always obeyed. Pierre pictured himself in a canoe hurtling down the white channel, flailing with his paddle. "You've never run it, have you?" There was a long pause. When Lalonde finally spoke, his eyes were fixed on the red crosses. "It's a tough carry," he repeated. Breakfast was the same as dinner, and the same as every other meal we'd have for the next 6 weeks, they said. Boiled corn and salt pork. Pierre nibbled at the first bite and then only realized how hungry he was. He devoured a heaping plateful, not caring whether it was corn or oats or hay. He was starving. Food helped drive the paddles, and he needed his strength to heal. When it was time to portage, Pierre carefully inspected both his parcels. Catching him with his hand beneath his pack flaps, Le Petit teased, "What are you fishing for, Pierre? I think you'd have better luck if you would try the river." "You know what I'm looking for," Le Petit, Pierre said. "No one's fooling me again with an overloaded pack. So I will have to find another pony to place my wagers on." "That's right. Well, here's your slice of the pie." With a big laugh that echoed up the rocky channel, he tossed Pierre a coin purse. Then, as Pierre was getting ready to hoist up a pack, Lalonde took him by the arm. "And here's a little present from me." Lalonde, his eyes lit with excitement, handed Pierre a sheath knife. The handle was carved caribou horn, and it had a moose hide sheath decorated with colored beading. "I couldn't take such a fine..." "No, you deserve it. You won the wager for us." "But this is too much," Pierre protested. "I promised you a share. I'm keeping my word. Besides, I made it myself. It's kind of a hobby of mine. A knife means more to a boy than a sack of coins, doesn't it?" Pierre nodded, awed by the gleam of the honed edge. If you look at the words carefully, you can see the knife kind of in there, the picture of it, but I'm just kidding. There's no picture of anything in here. "Besides, we white hairs have to stick together," Lalonde grinned, ruffling Pierre's hair. "Just don't cut your hand off. Your mom would skin my hide." When Pierre had both 90-pound parcels in place. He was amazed at how light they felt. The balance is so much better than the pack that they tricked him with, the one that rode low on his hips and put a strain on his back and neck. This load sat high and let him carry the weight with his legs. The rest of the day passed quietly in a mix of brief paddling stints and work with tracking lines. Most of the men were suffering from the previous night's celebration, and they looked peaked. Beloit complained so loudly that the whole brigade could hear. He claimed his mouth tasted like the inside of a British boot. The only excitement that occurred late in the day was when La Petite's bowman suddenly drew out of his northwest gun and fired towards the near shore. There was a furious flapping of wings, and after the smoke of the musket charge drifted downriver, Pierre saw a duck floating on the water. The canoemen cheered when the man tossed his kill to the cook, Andre Bellegarde. "Meat for the cooking pot," Lalonde called out. Emile grinned hungrily. "Duck soup!" Bellegarde stood up by the canoe, limp carcass in hand, and bowed dramatically to the benefactor. "Fine shooting, monsieur," he said. And that is the end of the chapter.